It turns out that, in fact, you have to define actuality, being, and causation before you can come to any sorts of conclusions about science or any sort of philosophy whatsoever. So I made a video, almost exactly a week ago, about formal logic and its applications. And I said that one of the natural results of this was the discovery of a God, specifically an omnipotent and personal God. So I'm going to tell my story of how I reached it via this, in addition to other readings as well. This will be a two-part series. The first one will be about a god specifically, and the second one, which will come out some point next week, will be about specific religions and which one makes the most sense. So to give some context on how I grew up, my dad was an atheist. My family was generally very secular, except for my mother, who was a moralistic therapeutic theist. So Christian, but not of any particular denomination, I don't think. And my grandfather, who is this interesting mix between Anglicanism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And I suspect that it's particularly his influence that made me love the Eastern churches so much and why I've invested so much time into them. Now, when I began to think about the world, I very quickly came to the conclusion that atheism was true, because I grew up in the 2000s and the early 2010s, and that sort of stuff was around a lot. However, the one problem was that I read voraciously and studied voraciously. And I don't even really mean for school. Ever since I was a very, very young child, I've been interested in history. And as a teenager, I developed interests in philosophy and computers. I actually study computer science as my current degree. So, with history, and also with what I studied in school, I found myself increasingly reading into the history of the Christian Church, because in order to have an understanding of, say, the history of the Reformation, you need to have an understanding of the Church. And this led to me reading a lot more into the philosophy of the time. So I'd come to understand, say, the writings of John Knox, the famous Scottish Reformed theologian, or of Voltaire, who I'm sure everyone's heard of. And I discovered very, very quickly that philosophy and religion were inextricably linked, to the point where one was almost the same as the other. Simultaneously, while I was studying, I also developed a very, very keen interest in politics, because of all of the crazy stuff that was going on within the country at the time, within Britain and within the Americas, with SJWs and stuff like that. So I ended up setting up a YouTube channel and talking about right-wing politics, specifically more traditional conservatism at that time. Think kind of a right-wing Sargon of Akkad kind of deal. This led me into discussions with a number of Christians because of the way my politics were formed. They were very similar to Protestant and to Catholic conceptions of politics. So eventually I ended up interacting with them, and with my knowledge of, well, what little knowledge I had of philosophy, the formal logic courses I was taking at the time for my degree, and also with the history that I had, I ended up entertaining them. I ended up talking to them, and eventually I had a live stream with one of them, a guy called Todd Lewis, and he finally managed to convince me of the value of Aquinas' contingency argument, although he used a version from the philosophy of René Descartes, specifically from a book called The Meditations on First Philosophy, which was the first proper book on metaphysics or being and time that I ever read. Now, for the next year, I didn't really reach any conclusions particularly on religions, but I did think a lot about what God actually was. And eventually I came to a number of conclusions that led naturally to Christianity. The thing that ultimately led to me becoming a Catholic, although I'll go into more detail about specifically choosing a religion in the later video, was a discussion I had with a YouTuber called Mathoma, who makes videos on classical theism and on mathematics. He's a very, very, very smart man. He's a doctor by training, was studying for his PhD and does mathematics as a hobby. So first of all, we have to talk about what the cosmological argument really is. We have one class of objects in the universe. Those objects that are contingent on something else. Those things that are caused. So, for example, if I speak into this microphone, it's leading to the information going into the computer and becoming sound waves on a WAV file. That's a simplification, but you see what I'm saying. Now, if this were every single class of things, then you would have an infinite regress. And if there were an infinite regress, then time would break, because time is the movements of these things. So you must have movement and causation in order to have time. Aquinas chooses specifically motion, and people misunderstand what he means by this. When he says this, he means causation. Now, from this, we can come to the conclusion that there is a start point. Now, what I didn't realise was the huge amounts of different things that result from this. Because if you have a thing that is the very first thing, what results? Well, we can say that it's uncaused or unactualized, so it therefore must exist without the need of time, because time is the movements of actualized things. We also know that everything comes from it, because it's uncaused, and therefore it must be being in itself. So, eventually what this argument or discussion with Mathoma resulted in was me recognizing that really what the unmoved mover was, and Aquinas goes to very great pains to describe this in the Prima Pars of the Summa Theologiae, is that God in himself is pure actuality. Now, there are tons of conclusions that you can come to based on this that are enumerated in the Summa Theologiae, but I'm going to speak specifically of three things here: the omnipotence of God, the omniscience of God, and the personality of God, in the sense that God must have a personality. So, omniscience. Why is God omniscient? Well, from him all being flows, and therefore he must have a conception of all things, and therefore he knows everything. Anything that happens in the world, anything that is actualized, because God is that actualizer in himself by virtue of being, he must know them. Otherwise they would be non-beings. Now, omnipotence should be pretty clear as well. If you have something that is all-being, then it can do anything. The statement, for example, that could God create a stone that he could not lift, is not a failure of God, it's a failure of language. Just because we can say something does not make it true. That's why we have logic to test premises. For example, I can say something like, all bananas never rot. And that would be a perfectly valid sentence to make. But it's wrong. Likewise with the rock comment. God does not have anything that he cannot do, because he is being itself. The mere fact that you can even utter that sentence is a representative of the fact that we are enabled to cogitate on things by the fact that by our being in God, we can do this. And finally, we can conclude that God must be personal and cannot be a force, because there are things with personalities that exist. A famous philosopher, Parmenides, made a very important statement that you cannot give an attribute to something that you don't already have. So the fact that we as human beings have personalities, and the fact that other animals like dogs can have personalities, indeed suggests to us that some aspect of that pure being has a personality, and therefore we can conclude that God in himself has a personality. This has largely been a response to atheists, but I also want to take a bit of a shooting at the hip response to pantheists as well. Those who believe that everything is God, whereas I am a panentheist or a classical theist in that I believe that God sustains everything. Now, there are two problems that on initial inspection I noticed with pantheism. The fact that I can tell the difference between a glass bottle and a light tells me that they have distinct being in and of themselves. A pantheist would have to tell you that they're just a different aspects of God. And that's fine, but I find that very weird. I don't see how you could address the light as just another name for God, or the bottle as another name for God. It would also mean that every single being to exist, including humans, would have no distinct identity at all. So we'd be in this weird position where we could know everything about everyone in every single determined way possible. So by some means I could come to know your entire essence, which is something which is ridiculous, because nobody has ever known another person's full essence or isness. It's simply something that's impossible. But on top of that, the one thing that really bothers me about pantheism is that I can clearly see diminishments of being everywhere. We already know that God is pure being, and pantheists have to concede this as well, because God exists and God is everything. So therefore he must be pure being. If this were the case, then there would be no distinctions in being. There would be no different levels of being. You wouldn't see people with diminished natures. For example, the whole concept of a disability would just cease to be, because, everyone would be at the apex of their being. You could never really have a difference between the live and the dead state, because you couldn't diminish being at all, because everything is pure being. So it becomes meaningless to speak in terms of living and dead, crippled and healthy, etc., etc., which is something that is self-evident within the world. So I couldn't possibly bring myself to believe that. So to put a conclusion on it, this is where I currently find myself in my intellectual journey through reading and through talking to people. But before that, I want to conclude with a rant, because I can see that a lot of people who run certain YouTube channels who can't come up with their own content have probably got something to say. So I can already hear Godless Fedora hitting his keyboard intently, or Rationality Autism yelling into his microphone about how reason and logic is really on their side. Now, I recognise, because I was once an atheist, that this is not the majority of atheists. The majority of atheists are genuinely curious people who want to learn about the world. Unfortunately, those sorts of YouTube atheist types, and you know exactly who you are, and their associates, are idiots. They're complete idiots. If you open any books on philosophy at all, be they formal logic, be they metaphysics, you very, very quickly come to realise, in interactions with them, that they are just autists who have no conception of any sort of philosophy at all, to the point where they'll defy it in favour of science, completely unaware that science is actually reliant on philosophy and was once called natural philosophy. So, I'll offer my argument here for those sorts of obstinance. You are miserable people, and you know you are miserable people. I've seen face cam recordings of you guys for over a decade, and I've had hours upon days of interactions with you. And I can tell that you're miserable people. You're overweight, you're addicted to weed, you're addicted to porn, you're in relationships that just don't work, or you're not in relationships at all. And you know why this is? It's because it's your own damn fault. And Christianity tells you, explicitly, in no uncertain terms, that there are certain rules to be followed in this regard. And this is why you rebel against it. You rebel because it tells you not to masturbate. You rebel because it tells you not to smoke weed. It rebels because it tells you not to indulge those passions that scream up from your id and insist that you do it. But like a weakling and a little boy, you listen to the screaming child and you follow it, and you throw away any actual reason. And you just disregard natural law ethics because it hurts your feelings. Because you think that morals are feelings. And anything that gets in the way of your moral feelings is wrong. That's exactly how these new atheist types behave. I've observed it enough. And they can give me this Yankee smugness or this pseudo-intellectualism all they like. But I don't especially care. If anybody makes a response to this that is of that ilk, I will just straight up ignore it. Because I know for a fact that I will have children and they won't. Because they have no way to rule their own lives, and they're insistent on not following anything. And that is why new atheists, because no one else will tell you, you are miserable. That's why you spend your entire time defying God, because it makes you feel guilty for all those horrific things that you've done, and those stupid things you've done. And you do not have the gumption to look yourself in the mirror and say, I've fucked up. God forces you to do that. So now, for those men who actually can do that, which is the vast, vast majority of you, The vast majority of you are legitimately looking to improve yourselves, and I am as well, in any way I can. So I've moved this to the end. I was going to put it just before I went into the whole process, but I figured it would make a lot more sense to put it at the end because it's a rather long rant. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and be aware that you're most likely not in this group of people. So, for all of those sane people, I thank you all for watching. Goodbye. A very big thank you to those on the list here. These are subscribers to the Renaissance Man program who get audio books and controversial videos every week for $5 a month. There's already quite a lot of content there, so if you check it out in the description, you won't be missing out. Thank you.